introduce Adrian Farewell to begin our next session. I welcome you to stay in this room and to continue to follow these important digital equity conversations. And I invite Adrian, who's the general manager of PBS, to join me as we introduce our keynote speaker, Larry Irving. Adrian, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate that. Larry Irving is the president of the Irving Group, a consulting firm providing strategic planning and consulting services to international telecommunications, media, and technology companies, as well as nonprofit organizations and philanthropies. Irving is also an operating partner and chief public policy, ESG, and DEI advisor to ZMC, which is a private equity firm. But prior to founding the Irving Group in 1999, Mr. Irving served for almost 7 years as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information at NTIA. He was one of the principal architects and advocates of the Clinton administration's telecommunications and internet policies, and was a point person in the administration's successful efforts to reform the United States telecommunications law, which resulted in the passage of the most sweeping change in America's telecommunications laws in 60 years. Mr. Irving is the chairman of the board of the Public Broadcasting Service, also known as PBS, but also serves in various roles on many other boards. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Northwestern University and is a recipient of the university's Alumni Merit Award for Distinguished Professional Achievement, and is a Salute to Excellence honoree of the Northwestern University Black Alumni Association. He is also a graduate of Stanford University School of Law. Larry Irving coined the term digital divide in 1995 and remains one of America's most consistent and clarion voices for digital equity. Please join me in welcoming him to the ASU Smart Region Summit as he shares his insights on where we go from here. Larry?
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. I much appreciated it. I hope you can hear me. I can't tell. Yeah, it looks like I'm on. I'm the only thing I'm sorry about, I spent the last 2 hours just rapt attention to this conversation, and I'm only sorry that I didn't have a chance to come to Arizona. I wanted to meet you, Adrian. I've heard great things from our mutual friend, Ken Shropshire, and others. But Lev, I always appreciate your reaching out to me. People have been sitting for 2 hours, so I'm going to do a little look at the past as we come to the future. So if you haven't stretched, stretch in your chair, stand up. I'm going to be talking for about a half an hour, and I really want people to be comfortable with talking. It's Yogi Berra, that great philosopher, once said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I've been involved in technology for over 40 years. When I look at technology and I think about technology, I realize how many really, really smart people, including myself, have been wrong. And I also want folks to, on this call, on this conference, in this summit, before the summit, after the summit, to think broadly. Because the reality is, when I started talking about the digital divide, millions of people told me, literally millions of people told me, there is this digital divide thing, the marketplace will solve it. There isn't that big an issue. We'll get there eventually. And here we are more than a quarter of a century later, and we're still dealing with that issue. So let me give you some of the great hits of technology wrong thinking. The president of Michigan Savings Bank told Henry Ford that the automobile is a fad, that horses are here to stay. Well, horses are here to stay, but I think most people say that automobiles are a little bit more than a fad. The president of Western Union said that the telephone has far too many shortcomings to be taken seriously as a means of communications. Objectively, it has no value. Okay? Darryl Zanuck, the great Darryl Zanuck, one of the great producers and motion picture executive, said in 1946, television will never hold on to an audience. People will very quickly get tired and bored of staring at a plywood box every night. T. Craven, you need to look this guy up. He is the only commissioner in the history of the world to be appointed twice. He was appointed, I believe, by Roosevelt, and then he was appointed by Eisenhower. He was a Democrat. He was a brilliant engineer. He was a Navy officer. And in 1961, after Sputnik, after the Kennedy inauguration, he said, there's practically no chance satellites will ever improve telephones, television, or radio reception in the United States. Andy Grove, the brilliant chief executive officer of Intel. The idea of a personal communicator in every pocket is nothing more than a pipe dream fueled by greed. And he got the greed part right, but I'm not so sure that he got the pipe dream part right. IBM talking to Xerox. Why would we make this? The global potential market for copying machines is 5,000 at absolute most. I'm betting 5,000 copying machines were sold in the last 24 hours, which might explain why IBM's had some ups and downs in its business model. But Ken Olsen, founder of DEC, a company I don't even know if it exists anymore, said, there's no reason an individual would ever want a computer in their home. And he said that in 1997. Finally, Paul Krugman is not just a renowned economist, but is a Nobel laureate economist, said, the internet will fade away because most people have nothing to say to each other. By 2005, it will be clear that the internet's impact on the global economy has been no greater than the fax machine. By 1998, there were over 150 million people on the internet, which is up from 15 million people when I came into government in 1993. So even if you're looking at trend lines, it's hard to figure out how Paul Krugman came to that particular conclusion. And I give you these predictions because it's important for folks to know that there are folks on this conference who are thinking of great ideas, who have a vision of what the world could be. And there are naysayers out there who are the only ones who can inhibit you getting to where you want to be. Plan, dream, plan, act, because that's how we get to where we are now with over 4.5 billion people on the internet. And again, when I started out doing this stuff, there were fewer than 15 million people in 1993. And sometimes people get it right. I happen to live in Washington, DC, and this is one of my favorite art pieces on the planet. If you're ever in Washington, go to the National Portrait Gallery / Smithsonian American Art Museum. You'll see this fabulous artwork by a brilliant Korean American artist who did this in 1995. He entitled it The Electronic Superhighway, and Lev may be the only person on this call who remembers it. In the 1990s, we used to call the internet the information superhighway. But what strikes me about this isn't just how it's a unified picture, but that in 1995, this young man had the vision to understand that the internet wasn't going to be about data and dots and dashes. It was going to be about video and audio and a completely integrated system of electronic communications. Every time I go into that museum and I see that, I realize that there are those of us who are capable of making predictions. ILS is generally not one of them. This is 1993, I believe. And the second time I met both the president and the vice president to talk about it. There was Secretary Ron Brown to talk about, we were all a lot younger then. I had some hair and it wasn't gray. And the president looked a little huskier than he does now. And Vice President Gore is a little gray and I think has a beard right now. So, but we were talking about connecting every school, every hospital, every library, every rural health clinic to the information superhighway / internet. It's important for all of you to remember, as I'm listening to Wendy, as I was listening to Nicole, as I was listening to folks today, realize that in 1993, not even 30 years ago, the concept of connecting every school and every library to the internet was a vision, was a dream. None of this was inevitable. Somebody had to think about it, somebody had to plan it, somebody had to fund it, somebody had to do it. That we got it done is something I'm always proud of, but that we had the vision to get it done is something I'm more proud of. The vision of Al Gore to connect that schoolgirl in Carthage, Tennessee, his hometown, to the Library of Congress was a driving vision. So whatever your driving vision is on this call, please, that's what makes it happen, having those visions. But it's not enough to just vision. You have to have a plan. And so my first job for the President of the United States was to create this information infrastructure agenda for action, working with the FCC, Department of Treasury, Department of Transportation, all the federal agents. We came together and said, we're going to create this agenda for action and identify what could be done and what it would mean. And we got to it. We released it September 15th, 93, and it became our handbook and our Bible. The second, next year, we created an agenda for cooperation to work with the rest of the governments on the planet to really drive out this internet. Again, that we're at 5 billion people, 4.5, 5 billion people on the internet tonight, that as I speak today, was not inevitable. It took planning, it took thought, but it also took dreams. So 1991, the year before President Clinton won, the year before I became an assistant secretary, this ad was in the newspapers. And what you see is if you wanted a clock radio, if you wanted a recorder, if you wanted a CD player, if you wanted a computer, if you wanted a telephone, if you wanted a scanner, all of those things required a separate purchase. You as a consumer, and I know a lot of you weren't even born in 1991, but you as a consumer had to buy all of these different things to do what one device could do. But in that the report that I mentioned in 1993, that agenda for action, this is what we wrote. We wrote, imagine you had a device that combined a telephone, a TV, a camcorder, and a personal computer. No matter where you went or what time it was, your child could see you and talk to you. You could watch a replay of your team's last game. You could browse the latest additions to the library, or you could find the best prices in town on groceries, furniture, clothes, whatever you needed. We wrote that in 1993. Some of you may remember that last week was the 15th anniversary of Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone to the world. What some of you may not remember is that that was 14 years after we predicted a device like the iPhone in government. It wasn't that we were technologists, it's that we had a dream and a vision. We knew that these technologies were convergent. The genius of Steve Jobs was that he had a commercial imperative, he had the technological chops, he had the managerial chops to make it happen. But the point I'm trying to make is that a bunch of technocrats and government officials, and me, a lawyer, came up with a vision of a device that we thought could be created, we needed created, we believed would benefit the world. And then the private sector went out and created it. To my mind, there's been no device in my lifetime that has changed the world as much as that device that Steve Jobs created. And the reason is because it's not just the device, is it also came up with tablets, and it also came up with readers, and it also came up with the App Store a year later. And it's also important to remember the App Store there was no App Store the first year. So those millions of apps we've created for Android and iOS and all of these different platforms, they happened because somebody created this device. This device happened because somebody had a dream that we could combine all of these tools into one product. Never let your dreams, never let anyone else deny your dreams, because they can come true and they can be much more impactful than even you could imagine. Some of the most impactful conversations I had in the 1990s was a gentleman named George Gilder. George is a conservative Republican economist. I am a progressive lawyer, non-economist, but I love the way he framed the conversation about where this internet revolution. In the mid-1990s, George predicted a revolution of sand and glass and air, and said that the millennium promises 1 billion transistors on a single sliver of silicon, 700 bit streams in a single thread of fiber, and a cellular infrastructure 1,000 times cheaper than today's. Maybe the most prescient prediction of the future that I've ever seen by any technologist. That sand is now a silicon chip, and that silicon chip today is 1 trillion times faster and 1 trillion times cheaper than that's the same kind of processing power of a chip in mid-1990s. That glass he was talking about are now fiber optic cables. And every year we go faster and faster, and the speeds we're able to predict now are driving things like 5G and soon to be 6G wireless. And that air are cell towers, not just across this country, but across the planet. And what's important to remember, in 1999, when I left government, half the people on this planet had never used a telephone. Half the people on this planet lived 2 or more hours from the nearest telephone in 1999. Today, virtually everybody has access to a telephone, and it's because of that revolution of sand and glass, but most importantly, air. And so companies like Verizon and companies like T-Mobile and their counterparts across the country have changed the world. They have made technology more available. But unfortunately, that digital divide is still there, and it's not available for all of us. Because whatever we predicted in 1993, whatever we had in mind in 1993, it wasn't this. No one, in my wildest, most utopian visions, I didn't believe I'd have access to this type of abundance of technology. The problem is that when some of us have an abundance of technology and others have no technology, that divide is even wider. We've had a concept called universal service in telephony since the 1934 Telecommunications Act, actually maybe the 1927 Telecommunications Act. We've always thought about the importance of having access to technology. We've also had a dynamic vision of what universal service means. as Angie so correctly said, Angie Seifer earlier today, and Nicole's talked about earlier today, and Wendy has talked about earlier today, it's important for us to have as dynamic a concept about the digital divide. That we can do one of two things. We can either begin to close that chasm, the digital divide, or we can allow technological advances to make it broader and wider. When some of us have a gig network, as I do, and I live down the street from a school, and I know that there are kids in that school who have no access to technology at home, to me, that's even worse than some of us having access to dial-up AOL and others not. Because what I can do with that gig network is so far surpassing what was happening in the 1990s when someone was just doing dial-up. But COVID-19, it changed everything. Because I've been on the, I am the guy who helped come up with the term digital divide. I have been proselytizing about it for years. There are millions of people, Angie and Laura Breeden and Nicole Turnley, you'll hear from others, and Lev and others who've talked about it. But I think all of us would admit that we weren't that optimistic that we'd ever see a really robust national, much less global response to that digital divide. What happened with COVID-19 is we began to understand what it really meant. What it meant to education, what it meant to healthcare, what it meant to people's life, what it meant to interacting with government. When the world was temporarily closed and the only way we had access to one another was through the internet, we kind of got our act together. We began to understand it was something we could and should do. As we're talking right now through Zoom, as we spent more of our hours on these Zoom calls looking like members of the Brady Bunch than we did interacting with other human beings, we realized there was a need for us to profoundly rethink the importance of connectivity. And we realized that there were 1 billion children in schools across the country, across the planet, who are impacted as schools closed. And tens of millions of students here in the United States, not just those tens who had access to technology and had to do home learning, but more importantly, those tens of millions who didn't have access to technology and couldn't learn at home, and whose libraries were closed because of the pandemic, and who didn't have community centers that they could visit. I will never forget, as long as I live, and as I'm older than almost everybody on this call today, so maybe my personal milk carton expiry date is getting closer, but however long I live on this planet, one of the most startling images to me will always be those two little girls of color, young Latino girls, sitting outside of a Taco Bell with their laptops on their knees, trying to get an education. In the richest country, in the richest community in that country, that should not stand. So where are we? We've talked about the NTI grant programs. They're going to have $50 billion plus. We're talking about the BEAD program. Thank you very much, Andy, for telling what BEAD actually stands for. I've been trying to figure that out for a few months now. NTI and Department of Commerce are really beginning to focus on tribal consultation. There are $50 billion just at NTIA, not counting state money, not counting all of the various ways that we can do something meaningful about technology. And so we have a time for a reset. And this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about what that reset means for the future. First of all, the reset means we're going to spend billions of dollars deploying broadband in places that need broadband and deploying wireless networks in places that need wireless networks. I hope that as we're spending this money, that we take a look at people who have failed their communities in the past and not fund some of them. And I also hope we'll look at these some of these programs as not providing a permanent subsidy, but rather than providing a permanent solution. And I'm happy to talk offline about the difference between permanent subsidy versus permanent solution, but a permanent subsidy is not the way we should be going, and I'm fearful that it will be. But I am very optimistic that for the first time, we'll start talking about making sure that tribal lands are fully connected and everybody on a tribal land has the kind of connectivity that they need and deserve. My first visit to a tribal community was in 1994, and that 28, and talking about bringing internet connectivity to the reservation. That 28 years later, we're still at a place where in some communities, 50 to 70% of tribal populations don't have access to the internet is not just appalling, it's disgraceful. When I was back in my government days, we started something called the Technology Opportunities Program. And one of Angie Seifer's colleagues, a woman named Laura Breeden, who has been a mentor to both me and a muse to both me and to Angie, really helped me think about how you should use technology and what kinds of questions you should ask as you're spending. Now, you're seeing NTIA, my old agency, has $50 billion to spend. At the height of of my time at NTIA, I had $100 million in 1 year. But with that $100 million, we funded access to schools, access to libraries, access to community health centers, access to community technology centers, remote learning, museums. What we did was we created public-private partnerships. Thanks to President Crow, thanks Ms. Irwin for talking about public-private partnerships back in the 1990s to demonstrate what could happen. And then we took our knowledge from the programs we funded and we circulated them across the country and across the planet so that other people could see the beneficial impacts of technology. One of the programs that we funded that no one much thinks about now is that in the Tennessee asked us for a grant in public-private partnership to give money to ambulances, because that golden hour right after an accident is so important. And by connecting ambulances, we'd be able to save lives. There isn't an ambulance on the planet now that doesn't have access to technology. How important, how powerful is that? How many lives have been saved? Another program that we funded was called, was for firemen. We got a grant asking us to fund fire trucks to get to and from fires faster. I said, I'll only fund it if you also map out what's happening in the buildings where the firemen might arrive. So that if there's a hotspot or a skylight, I had an uncle who was a fireman who'd fallen through a skylight and broken his back. And I wanted to make sure that no other firemen had that kind of a problem. If we can get you there, can we get you there to do something safely around that fire? And so now we're seeing all kinds of VR and AR applications for fire devices. What I'm saying is think outside the box and think about what this technology could be in its ultimate form. We need to ask every time we make an investment of that $50 billion, what's the purpose of the investment? What problem or investment, what problem is this investment solving or intended to solve? How will it make this investment more accessible and affordable? How will this investment help make broadband connectivity beneficial for users? And Peter asked another important question that I should have had on there. How will we sustain after the investment has been made? And Mr. Saigo, that I'm gonna have to add a fourth bullet to that slide. We talk about smart cities and the importance for municipal networks, library access, community network access, but think about what smart cities can mean for environment and safety and traffic. But whatever we do about smart cities, we have to make sure that we load in privacy at the beginning. We're going to have smart cities, but we can have smart cities that are invasive of our privacy. We have smart cities that protect our privacy. I love this summit when we're talking about bringing digital equity to a region. And as we're talking about regions, how do we do information sharing across these regions? How do we get the richest and the poorest in these communities fully engaged together toward the process of digital equity? One of the things I'm really excited about in states that are more agricultural, I live in Washington, D.C., we don't really have agriculture, but one of the things I'm really concerned about is precision agriculture. And how do we do more there so that smaller farmers, more subsistence farmers can also benefit? The way we do all of this is design thinking. Think up front, what's our plan? How do we help those who need the help most first? And we know we're gonna need more capacious and speedier networks. We've talked about 5G, friends, 6G is coming. And what's important about 6G is that every important improvement that 5G will bring will also be there for 6G. VR and AR systems will be more powerful. Smart cities, farms, regions will be connected. We'll have an artificial intelligence at our fingertips. We'll have robotics working in factories, allowing people not to have to do physical labor that's breathtaking or dangerous. We'll have vehicle-to-vehicle communication, which will ease some of our traffic problems and cut down on pollution. I'm gonna take the word that no one's mentioned today, and I'm shocked, and talk about meta. When you talk about meta, it's not just a word for those of us invested in Facebook, of whom I'm not one. The metaverse is the virtual reality space which users can interact with the computer-generated environment and other users. Walmart is using it to train some of its workers. Fire departments using it. Police departments are using it. I was talking to a guy in an auto repair shop talking about how there's now training so people can learn how to paint cars or repair cars without actually having to have the physical machine there. We are in an era where VR and AR really do matter. But it's also about learning skills like football or basketball or almost any physical skill. And yes, I needed to put a Stanford person up there because I'm at ASU and we're Pac-12 rivals. But at Stanford, there's also the first virtual class. Students there are floating in space, gaping down at the planet Earth. They're swimming among coral reefs. They might have gone for a week, they might go for a walk, but they're going for a walk as a person with a skin color different than their own, person subjected to prejudice. And for those of us involved in public broadcasting who are storytellers, imagine the immersive ability to not just be in Watford, Downton Abbey, but to be in Downton Abbey. Those kinds of new immersive opportunities are coming. I don't believe you can hate somebody if you know their story. And I honestly believe immersive technologies allow us to understand each other, to be in each other's heads in a different way than we've ever been before. The Zoom boom, look, we've seen a 3,300% increase in Zoom since the beginning of the pandemic, a 3.3 trillion minutes up from 10 million, 300 million daily participants up from 10 million. We all know Zoom's the way we're going, but telehealth is another way. My mom is 92 years old. We did more telehealth appointments with her over the last 2 years than we did in person, because at 92 with COVID, she could talk to her doctor. That is increasingly the way we are going to be sharing health information. But for those of you who have children, and if you've ever been in a NICU and you've watched a child that's all tied up in wires, understand that this new technologies will allow wireless technologies. You won't have that child in wires. A couple of professors, my other alma mater, Northwestern University, are making it possible for kids to come out of NICU for their parents to be able to hold them and love them while they're healing. That's going to be not just in Chicago, that will be all over the planet, including places that don't have all the machinery we see arrayed behind this child behind us. Couple last points. The ultimate laboratories for innovation in technology are going to be the states, where those folks who are closest to the problem are going to be most able to give us the solution. And what we need to do, all of us, and I've heard this word several times today, are create communities of collaborators. I just put some of the collaborators that I know well or that are on this call. There are so many others that if we take what Dr. Bielenson doing with that virtual human lab interaction, connected with Humanity, have ASU working with Brookings doing some policy, NDI talking to people in the community, and Pew Research Center giving us statistics, think of how much more powerful than any one of those folks, and then add a global perspective on that. Together we create, together we have force. And I want all of you to remember that the pace of innovation over the next 10 years is going to dwarf everything we've seen over the past 25 years. And what matters is that it's not just 15 million North Americans as we started in 1993, but it's 4 billion people across the planet. It's folks that Emirates is trying to help. It's folks that Peter's trying to help. It's all of us together. When you add the international component to what we're trying to do, it's going to be so much more powerful. William Gibson said, the future is not here, it's not evenly distributed. But it's not evenly distributed just across the globe, or not just across the United States, or not just communities in Arizona or DC or NYC. But in every place we think, some of us have an abundance of technology while others of us have almost no technology. So I'm going to end where I started. For each of us, it's imperative that we dream big dreams, teletopian dreams, dreams about how we're going to use these technologies to change the world. And then that we plan, figure out, when we get the data, get the understanding, work with the Nicoles, work with the Pews of the world to understand exactly where we are, talk to folks like Angie and Laura to understand what the numbers look like, reach out to Emmet, reach out to Peter so we have a global perspective, and then act. And finally, well, almost finally, there's nothing wrong with technology that can't be remedied by what's right with technology. You'll hear horror stories about technology, but remember all the good that it's doing. And when I think about the good that it's doing, I constantly remember that Dr. Martin Luther King gave a sermon at the church I go to most Sundays when it was open before we closed down, Washington National Cathedral. It was his last speech, his last sermon before he was brutally assassinated. With MLK Day coming on Monday, I thought maybe I should just read, for parting, these few comments from Dr. King. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that a great revolution is taking place in the world today. That is a technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. Now, whenever anything new comes into history, it brings with it new challenges and new opportunities. Geographic oneness of this age has come into being to a large extent through modern man's scientific ingenuity. Modern man, through his scientific genius, has been able to dwarf distance and place time in chains. Through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood. But somehow, and in some way, we must. Thank you very much. And as you're going into Model Thing Weekend, think about that. Automation, cybernation, neighborhood, brotherhood. That's exactly what this conference has been about. And I think all of us have an opportunity to fulfill Dr. King's technology dream.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much for your inspiration, for your compassion, your passion, your intelligence, and for being able to pull threads across time and geography. Really, as always, and I've always enjoyed the times that we've had together. I too only wish that you were here to be sharing and to visit us here, and of course you and everyone else who is online. When you're feeling comfortable and safe, you are all most welcome to come visit us here at ASU. Larry, all the best to you.